The office building stood tall, gleaming in the sunlight like a symbol of power and sophistication. This was a place where only the best thrived. At the center of it all stood the company, a name synonymous with success, exclusivity, and power. Known for its elite clientele and cutting-edge solutions, it had built a reputation that commanded respect across industries. The company wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of status. To work here meant you had made it, and the walls of this office whispered tales of top executives' million-dollar deals and the high stakes of corporate life. But with all the prestige and grandeur came a quiet undercurrent. The air of authority was undeniable, an invisible barrier that separated those who belonged from those who didn't. Here titles mattered, positions defined worth, and the culture was one of silent competition. Everyone knew their place, and those who rose to the top did so with skill, but also with the right connections, the right look. It was a world that demanded respect, but one that also left little room for anyone who didn't fit the mold. She walked through the revolving doors, the sharp click of her heels against the marble floor, cutting through the quiet hum of the office lobby. Her presence was poised, yet there was something undeniably commanding about the way she carried herself. The black woman was dressed impeccably, a tailored blazer that fit perfectly, a pencil skirt that accentuated her grace, and a subtle yet elegant necklace that hinted at sophistication without shouting for attention. Her eyes scanned the room with purpose as she moved effortlessly through the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman engrossed in her phone, looked up briefly, offering a polite smile, but not much else. It was the same reaction she'd gotten from most people, glances that barely lingered, a flicker of recognition that quickly turned back to the task at hand. No one paid her much attention, not really. She was just another woman in business attire blending into the sea of professionals. Yet there was a quiet confidence in her steps that contrasted the cold efficiency of the office around her. Her face remained calm, unreadable, but there was something in the way she held herself, a quiet power that seemed almost out of place in this busy corporate world. She moved through the crowd unnoticed, but not quite invisible. People glanced at her, maybe briefly wondered who she was, but then quickly turned back to their own concerns. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, no indication of the influence she held, the wealth she possessed, or the secrets she carried with her. She was just another face in the crowd, yet the subtle mystery about her seemed to whisper that she was not. The manager sat behind his sleek modern desk, the sharp lines of his suit mirroring the rigid authority he exuded. He was middle-aged with salt and pepper hair, combed meticulously to the side, his sharp features hardened by years of navigating the corporate world. His gaze was cool, calculated, always sizing up, always measuring. In a place like this, his position gave him the power to look down on those who crossed his path, and he wielded it without hesitation. His office was an extension of his personality, organized, impersonal, and demanding respect without having to earn it. He was used to people following his lead, never questioning his decisions. But beneath his composed exterior lay a simmering arrogance, one that came from years of climbing the corporate ladder and dismissing those who didn't fit his idea of success. He had a reputation among the employees, particularly women and people of color, a reputation for being dismissive, for underestimating those who didn't resemble the high-powered executives he was accustomed to dealing with. To him, the world was a place of hierarchies, and those at the bottom didn't deserve his time. He'd roll his eyes at a woman's suggestions or brush off the ideas of employees who didn't look like they belonged in his world. He'd pass subtle, condescending remarks, certain that no one would dare challenge him. It wasn't just an act. It was his way of asserting control, of reminding everyone that he was the gatekeeper to success. His interactions with others were steeped in a quiet superiority, the kind that made people hesitate before speaking up, the kind that made them wonder if it was even worth it to try. To him, the office was his kingdom, and everyone else was simply a subject passing through. She walked up to the receptionist's desk, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight ponytail and a quick smile, looked up from her computer screen. For a moment, their eyes met, and the receptionist gave a polite nod, a glance that suggested a momentary recognition of her presence. "Excuse me," the black woman said, her voice calm but firm. "Could I reserve a meeting room?" The receptionist paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment. "I'm sorry, but you'll need the manager's approval to book a room," she said, glancing towards the back office where the manager was likely working. "He handles all the room assignments." The black woman nodded, unfazed, and turned toward the manager's office without another word. The receptionist, meanwhile, went back to her screen, already distracted by another task. It wasn't unusual for the manager to handle these things himself. His office was the hub of control, and everything seemed to flow through him, no matter how small the request. There was something almost routine in the exchange, like the receptionist had seen this same interaction happen 100 times before. The black woman didn't flinch, didn't make a fuss. She simply understood the system, knew what to do next. It was clear. She wasn't here to make waves. She just wanted what she needed. Yet as she walked past, the receptionist's eyes briefly flicked over her attire, maybe wondering why someone like her would need the manager's approval at all. But that thought vanished quickly, replaced by the monotony of the day ahead. The woman stepped into the manager's office without hesitation. The space was pristine, polished to perfection, with expensive furniture and a view that screamed success. The manager looked up from his desk, his eyes briefly scanning her before returning to the papers in front of him. She could feel the weight of his gaze, a subtle dismissiveness in it, but she remained steady. "Excuse me, I'd like to book a meeting room," she said, her voice even and professional. "I was told you handle the bookings." The manager barely looked up this time, his fingers tapping against the desk. "The rooms are reserved for high-ranking employees," only he said without missing a beat. "You'll have to check with your superior to see if there's availability." Her request was simple, straightforward, but his response was anything but. He assumed that someone like her wouldn't have the authority to book a room, that she couldn't possibly be in a position to need such a space. The words slipped out almost unconsciously as he added, "I'm sure it's not a big deal. I'm sure you can wait for one of the lower-level rooms if you really need one." There it was, the undercurrent of judgment. The casual, racially insensitive remark that told her exactly where he placed her in the hierarchy of this office. To him, her appearance said it all. She wasn't someone who belonged in the spaces where important decisions were made. His tone dripped with condescension, and for a split second, he even smirked, satisfied with his dismissal. He didn't bother to look her in the eye again, as if his word was final. She stood there, her posture unchanged, the calmness in her expression, a stark contrast to the tension building in the room. The manager's words hung in the air, but she didn't flinch. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle satisfaction in his voice, as he thought he had dismissed her without a second thought. Instead of arguing, she let a slight cryptic smile curl on her lips, a smile that wasn't warm, but neither was it confrontational. It was almost knowing, as though she had just decided to entertain his ignorance for a moment longer. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between them, before finally speaking in a voice so smooth that almost didn't feel real. "You'll regret this," she said, her words slow and deliberate, yet carrying an undeniable weight. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew that the tides were about to turn. The manager, who had been expecting her to leave in defeat, paused for a moment, perhaps caught off guard by her calm. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but she was already turning away, her heels clicking softly against the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet office. She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need to. There was a sense of finality in the way she moved, a quiet power that said she had no intention of playing by his rules. The manager let out a short laugh, a smug, self-assured chuckle that filled the room with a sense of superiority. Regret it, he repeated with a scoff, clearly amused by her words. You're funny. He waved her off dismissively, as if her remark was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise perfect day. He leaned back in his chair, the arrogance in his posture as clear as ever. Look, he continued, we have certain procedures around here. High-ranking employees get first dibs, and well, you don't exactly fit the profile, do you? He chuckled again, a sound that felt more like a final judgment than a mere joke. His eyes roamed over her, and though he tried to hide it, the sneer in his voice betrayed him. You know, some of us work hard to earn these privileges. I'm sure you're just trying to find your place here. He paused, making sure to let the words linger in the air. A bit out of your depth, aren't you? The woman didn't respond, her expression still calm, almost serene. But the words stung, not because she was affected, but because they revealed so much about the manager's character. Still, she didn't flinch. She simply turned on her heel and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her with a sense of finality. The manager watched her go, a smug grin still on his face. He didn't think twice about her departure. He believed he had won this small battle, certain that she'd slink away in defeat. After all, what could someone like her possibly do against someone like him? With a shake of his head and a muttered comment, he returned to his work confident that nothing had changed. The next morning, the black woman walked through the doors of the building once again, but this time, everything about her was different. Her outfit was sharp, commanding, an expertly tailored suit in a deep, striking color that seemed to demand attention without being flashy. The blazer was fitted to perfection, and the heels clicked with purpose as she moved through the lobby, every step a quiet declaration of authority. Her demeanor had shifted too. Gone was the calm, almost invisible presence from the day before. Now she moved through the space with a kind of quiet power, each movement calculated, deliberate. She didn't glance at anyone or try to catch anyone's eye. Instead, she let the energy around her shift as she passed. The atmosphere in the lobby seemed to change as she walked by. The hum of conversations quieted and the buzz of activity slowed down for just a moment. The receptionist who had greeted her so indifferently the day before looked up this time, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the woman's confident stride. She glanced over to the other employees who had also stopped what they were doing and were now watching with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. Whispers started to ripple through the air. Wait, isn't she? One employee murmured to another, trailing off as the realization hit. The receptionist's face shifted from neutral to something closer to disbelief. She exchanged glances with a coworker as if trying to confirm her thoughts. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. She wasn't just any visitor to the office. This woman, this confident, commanding figure, was someone important. The black woman continued to walk through the lobby, the whispers growing louder in her wake. There was no mistaking it now. People were beginning to understand who she really was. The woman they had brushed off as just another employee was no ordinary person. The shift in energy was palpable. She wasn't here as a stranger anymore. She was here as someone who belonged in this space and perhaps even owned it. The woman walked into the manager's office with the same unshakable confidence that had carried her through the building. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment the manager didn't even look up from his papers. He was too absorbed in his work, too comfortable in the assumption that his day would go on as usual. But when he finally glanced up and saw her standing there, his face drained of color. His eyes widened, his expression shifting from casual indifference to sheer shock. He blinked a few times, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. "What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice faltering as he tried to regain his composure. He half rose from his chair, clearly caught off guard by her presence, but unsure of how to respond. The woman stood still, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at him. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she feel the need to explain herself. Instead, she simply stated, "I'm the owner of this company." The words hung in the air heavy with their truth. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, trying to form a response, but no words came. He glanced up and down at her, still not quite believing it, as though the very idea that someone like her could hold such power was too absurd to consider. After a long pause, she calmly added, "You know, the same woman you refused to give a meeting room to yesterday." His face flushed, the color returning in patches as realization began to settle in. The disbelief turned to embarrassment, and the manager stammered, trying to recover from the shock. I didn't know. I thought you were." She didn't let him finish. "You assumed I didn't belong here," she said flatly, her voice still calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "That was a mistake." The manager was silent, his eyes darting between her and the papers on his desk, clearly scrambling to process what had just happened. But the woman didn't wait for him to regain his composure. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The woman turned back to face the manager, who was still sitting in shock, his mouth agape as he processed the truth. She didn't need to say much more. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. But her voice was steady and firm as she spoke. "You're fired," she said simply, the words landing with quiet authority. The manager blinked, still trying to come to terms with what was happening. What, he stammered, his face turning pale. He was too stunned to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. His fingers fumbled over his desk, as if he might somehow undo what had just been said. She took a step forward, her gaze unflinching. "Your actions yesterday were unacceptable," she continued, her voice unwavering. "No one should ever be judged based on their appearance, their race, or their gender. What you did was not only unprofessional, it was discriminatory." The manager opened his mouth, but no words came. He couldn't argue with the truth that hung heavy in the air. He had made a terrible mistake, and now the consequences were clear. She paused, her eyes locked onto his, the silence between them thick with the weight of her words. "You created a hostile environment by dismissing me, thinking I wasn't worthy of respect because of how I looked. And that is not something I will tolerate under any circumstances." The office felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves had closed in. The manager's shoulders slumped as the reality of the moment settled in, but the woman didn't linger. She turned and walked toward the door, her head held high, each step sure and deliberate. The air in the office seemed to freeze as she left, the employees who had witnessed it all remaining silent, too stunned to move. Her exit was swift, her power undeniable, and the office was left in a stunned silence, the echoes of her words hanging in the air long after she was gone. As the manager sat in the empty office, the weight of the past few moments crushed down on him. His arrogance, his dismissiveness, his assumptions about who belonged and who didn't, those were the very things that had led to his downfall. He had thought his position, his power, could shield him from the consequences of his actions, but it hadn't. His prejudice had blinded him, and in the end, it was his own bias that brought him down. The reality of his situation was now painfully clear. His years of mistreating others, of judging based on race, gender, and appearance, had cost him everything. He had underestimated someone who was much more than he could ever have imagined. And in doing so, he had lost his place in a world that values respect, fairness, and opportunity for all. This wasn't just a story of one man's fall from grace. It was a powerful reminder that we must never judge others based on how they look or what we think they represent. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their background, and no one should be reduced to assumptions or stereotypes. The woman who had walked into that office had shown him what true strength and dignity looked like. She had shown him that appearances can be deceiving and that every person holds more power than what meets the eye. In the end, the manager's fate was sealed by his own choices. And as for the woman, her actions reminded us all that we should never underestimate anyone, for people are always more than they seem at first glance. What do you think of this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone was judged unfairly based on appearances or assumptions? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your perspective on the power of respect and equality. If this story inspired you, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories, just like this stories that remind us of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and never underestimating someone based on how they look. We're bringing you more lessons, more inspiration, and more eye-opening moments. Don't miss out, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Just a quick note, this story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment and inspiration purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The message, however, about respect, equality, and not judging others based on appearances is something we can all learn from.